You see that play there? That's the fatal goal, you could say. I think most people have already seen it, right? 1994 World Cup Colombia against the United States. That defender who just pushed the ball into his own goal is Colombian, and 10 days after that play, he was dead, shot in a parking lot in the city where he was born. And like I said, a lot of people know this part of the story. The player who paid with his life for an own goal. It's one of the saddest stories that a World Cup has ever produced, but hardly anyone mentions that detail. It wasn't just that goal that explains his death. The death that helps explain this story happened 7 months before this player's death, and at first glance, it had nothing to do with soccer. This is a story with many layers, and we're going to investigate all of them. December. A man runs awkwardly across the roof of a two-story house, tripping over the tiles, trying to get from one eave to another. Down below, dozens of armed men surround the entire block. When he appears at the edge of the roof, they open fire. He falls face down right there on top of the tiles. He dies barefoot, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. This is the first man to die in this story. And I know that at first glance, he doesn't seem to have anything to do with the soccer player dying in a parking lot, does he? But look, I can tell you it has a lot to do with it. Now let's jump 7 months ahead. Same city, 3 in the morning. It's a dark nightclub parking lot. Our defender is alone there in his car, about to leave. A group then comes out of the darkness and surrounds the vehicle. There's a brief argument and then the shots come, several, one after another. And the witnesses who were nearby would swear for the rest of their lives that with each shot, one of the men shouted a specific word. He repeated that as if he was celebrating. Who was the man on the roof? What was the word that this killer shouted with each shot? And how did the death of one open the way for the death of the other? That's what we're going to see in today's episode. I'm Marcos Campos. And this is the story of two of the most beloved players in Colombian soccer. At a time when Colombian soccer was, let's say, influenced by the dirtiest money in the world. And how that money, even after its owner was dead, still seemed to reach everything around. Well, get comfortable and let's get to the facts. The night. Andrés Escobar, our defender, the central character of today's episode, was born in Medellin, Colombia in 1967. And a defender, in most people's minds, is that tough guy, right? The one who kicks, who hits hard, who stops the game with brute force. But Andrés was nothing like that, okay? He played clean in a way that was almost unusual for his position and for that time. He would start plays with the ball at his feet, rarely committed rough fouls, and he rarely went to ground claiming a foul when there hadn't really been one, you know? He even got a nickname because of this behavior. The nickname caught on throughout the whole country. The Knight of Soccer. He came up from the youth team of Atlético Nacional, the team from his hometown, and became a starter in a generation that was about to make history with that team. And the magnitude of that story showed itself in 1989. Nacional won the Copa Libertadores, the biggest club competition in South America, something that no Colombian club had achieved before. It was in a very close final against Olimpia from Paraguay, decided by penalties there in Bogotá. Nacional's goalkeeper, Higuita, that guy who's kind of a genius, kind of crazy, who would dribble past attackers out in midfield, saved 4 penalty kicks that night. Andrés, the 22-year-old defender at the time, took and scored his penalty. He played all 14 games of that victorious campaign from start to finish. But there's a detail to this story of glory, and the detail lies in the origin of the money that, let's say, helped support and build that championship team. Check this out. The Atlético Nacional from that time carried a shadow that the entire Colombian soccer world knew about. According to what they say, there was suspicion that part of the money and influence around the club came from drug trafficking. None of that showed up as an official contract, obviously, but the association was so strong that rivals even turned it into a way to provoke them. Pablito bought it for you. Something in Portuguese like, let Pablito buy that for you, you know? And this Pablito is exactly who you think it is. He even had the same last name as our defender, Escobar. And no, before you ask, they weren't related, okay? Well, all that money then came with its own order. An order, in the classic sense, in a place like that, Medellin, depended on just one man to exist. As long as that man was alive, there were rules. There was someone at the top deciding what could and couldn't happen in that city. And that's the central point of the whole puzzle. Logically, the day that man dies, the rules die with him. The death goal. 5 years after that victorious Libertadores campaign, already in 1994, Colombia arrived at the World Cup in the United States as one of the favorite teams to win the title. And it wasn't just fan exaggeration, okay? In the qualifying stage, they had gone all the way to Buenos Aires, just so you know, and crushed Argentina at home by 5-0. Even Pelé went so far as to say that Colombia was the best team in the tournament. They had the legendary Valderrama, Ramos in the midfield, Asprilla up front, our well-known Fred Rincon, and Andrés, the big defender in the back. That was the so-called golden generation. But then, out of nowhere, things started to go wrong. Colombia lost their debut 3-1 to Romania. It was a shock. And what happened after that, almost nobody talks about in this story. One of the midfield players received a death threat by fax right there in the middle of the World Cup while staying at the team hotel in training camp. The coach even considered resigning in the middle of the tournament, and the threatened player ended up being taken out of the lineup. I mean, even before any tragedy, that squad was already playing with people threatening them under a lot of serious pressure, and threatening to kill a player and directly pressuring the lineup of a national team like that, blatantly with no one to stop it, wasn't normal even for Colombia at that time, okay? It was a sign that something had gone off the rails in the country. The second game of that World Cup was against the host, the United States, at the Rose Bowl Stadium over in Pasadena, California. A game that Colombia needed to win to keep clear chances of qualifying for the second round. It was 0-0 until around the 33rd minute or so on the broadcast clock. A play that the official match reports usually record as 1 minute and 35 seconds of that game. That's when Americano crossed the ball low into the box. Andrés, doing what every defender does there throughout their entire career, stretched out to try to cut off that cross before it reached the opposing striker. But then the ball hit his leg and went into Colombia's own goal. The goalkeeper didn't move. He couldn't do anything. The United States won 2-1. Colombia still beat Switzerland 2-0 in the last game, but it was too late. They were already eliminated in the first stage of the World Cup. The favorite for the title was knocked out in the first stage, and the face of that elimination for the whole country became Andrés, the gentleman. The defender who put the ball into his own goal. What Andrés did in the following days says everything about who he really was. Instead of hiding, he wrote. He published a column in one of Colombia's biggest newspapers, speaking directly to the fans. He asked for respect, thanked the people's support, and asked the country to look forward. And then came the decision that changed the course of this story. They told the entire team, all the players, not to keep their heads down when they returned to the country. Andrés' family asked him not to go to Medellin so soon. He went anyway. He returned home to his city to be among the people he loved. 10 days after the own goal, he was dead. The parking lot. On the night of between July 1st and 2nd, 1994, Andrés went out with some friends to clear his mind. They started at a bar in the neighborhood and then went to a nightclub called El Indio. They stayed there until about 3 in the morning. When they decided to leave, the group dispersed in the parking lot. Each went to their own car, and Andrés stayed there a little longer in his car. And that's when the group appeared that would mark this story forever worldwide. A group of men surrounded Andrés and started provoking him. They kept throwing his mistake back in his face and hurling some especially harsh insults. Andrés, true to the nickname he had until the very last minute, didn't run away or fight back. He tried to argue, said it had been an honest mistake, part of the game, that no one makes mistakes on purpose, and he asked for respect. The answer he heard, according to what was found out, was something like this: "You don't know who you're messing with." Because two of those men were the Gallo and Now brothers, Santiago and Pedro Davi. Businessmen, ranchers, horse breeders, and drug traffickers connected to organized crime from Medellin. People who went around with a driver and armed security. And it was exactly their driver and security guard, a man named Humberto Munhoz Castro, who pulled out a pistol and shot Andrés. 6 shots. He was shot from behind while he was still there next to the car. And remember that word I told you at the beginning of the episode that witnesses swore they heard with every shot? That word was goal. They say the shooter shouted goal with every shot he fired at Andrés, as if each bullet was a punishment for that play. Andrés was rushed to the hospital, but he didn't make it. He died about 45 minutes after being admitted. He was 27 when it happened and planned to get married later that year. And there was even interest from Milan, in Italy, to sign him after the World Cup. None of that was possible. But now, notice a detail that seems like just background, but it's actually the heart of the whole thing. In the early 1990s, Medellin recorded something like 380 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants at the peak of violence there. One of the highest rates in the world. Killing someone in the parking lot at 3 in the morning, it wasn't, let's say, exactly news. And that's why this group of men managed to surround and execute a national idol in the middle of the street just like that, outside a busy nightclub, shouting goal with every shot without any fear that anything would come of it. They acted like people who didn't have to answer to anyone. And look, they really didn't, you know? The question is, since when didn't they have to? The whole country was outraged, so much blood after that. What the court delivered, however, was a confession and almost nothing else. The unanswered questions. The pressure to solve the case came from the top down. The prosecutor in charge of the investigation, a man named Jesus Albero Yepes, would say years later that everyone wanted the crime solved, from the president to the most ordinary Colombian. And that if they had had the chance, maybe they would have lynched the suspects, and the case moved quickly, actually. A little too quickly for a place where almost nothing ever got solved, if you know what I mean. Right after the crime, the Gallo brothers and also their driver tried to forge an alibi. They went to the police and reported that the pickup trucks they had used that night had been stolen, the pickup trucks that surrounded Andrés. But a witness had already described the shooter's vehicle to the investigators, and the description matched these pickup trucks. The lie fell apart in a few hours. The day after the murder, Humberto Munhoz Castro, the brother's driver and security guard, was arrested and confessed that he was the one who shot. He was sentenced in June 1995 to 43 years in prison. It seemed enough, didn't it, considering the situation at the time? But then, things started to take a really bizarre turn which outraged the country and the family to this day. That 43-year sentence was gradually reduced over the years through sentence reductions for work and study. In the end, the man who killed Andrés served about 10 years, 10 to 11 years, and was released in 2005. Andrés' father would later say bluntly that the Colombian justice system was a sham, that it deceived the people and his family by saying 43 years and then releasing the killer as soon as people forgot about it. But you must be wondering about the Gajon brothers, right? That's the gap that the case never filled. They were not convicted as the masterminds behind the murder. They faced a much lighter charge related to covering up the crime and ended up escaping the brunt of the punishment. The shooter took the blame alone and refused to turn in his bosses. I wonder why, right? And then comes the question that seems the simplest and actually is the hardest in this case. After all, why did Andrés die? The world immediately accepted the most obvious answer, right? Because of the own goal, revenge from a crazed fan, or from someone who lost a lot of money with Colombia's elimination. After all, a lot of people had bet on Colombia, as we remember, right? Colombia was one of the favorites. And this version has real facts behind it. The provocations were about the own goal, and the shots came with the word goal being shouted. Everything points to that. But there's always a but, isn't there? When you listen to those who studied the case closely, things get a bit complicated. Soccer historians say that Andrés wasn't killed just because of the own goal. The own goal was indeed the spark that started the argument that ended in gunshots. The prosecutors worked with another hypothesis, that the Gayam had lost money on high-stakes bets in Colombia during that game, and that the crime was related to that. Let me explain this part better, because while I was editing, I realized that there was some information missing in this part of the script. Here's what happened, guys. Yeah, according to what was reported, the own goal wasn't exactly the reason for this murder. What happened is that there was an alleged financial loss for the drug dealers. So, just like the coach of the Colombian national team is going to say, and I'll talk more about this later in the video, anyone was at risk there. So, Andrés, in that sense, was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, other things that I'll also talk about later could have happened in that nightclub. And that was the opportunity for the crime, okay? But it's not like, oh, he scored the own goal. No. Now, just because you come back to Colombia, you're going to die because of that own goal. It's all the background, right? The guys supposedly lost money. So, let's say that any player, any participant in that World Cup was at serious risk there in Colombian territory. Because from everything I've already mentioned and will mention in the video, it was tough, right? Well, I think it's a bit more understandable now. The coach of that team, years later, gave a more blunt version about it. He said that Andrés was unlucky to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, that it wasn't premeditated, and that at that time in Colombia, anyone could die. Saying that about all the participants, right? After all, if they had lost but the own goal hadn't happened, that's what he meant. Even a famous former hitman from the cartel said that it was just a silly fight that got out of control regarding Andrés' death. And in 2026 now, as you'll see in a bit, yet another version of everything came up. Revenge for the goal, gambling debt, bar fight, pure bad luck. I'll tell you about another hypothesis soon, but none have ever been confirmed as true, okay? More than 30 years later, the immediate motive for Andrés' murder remains, I would say, unanswered. No clear and definitive answer. But there's a different question from that one, and that one I can answer for you. Not because they shot him, that nobody really knows for sure as we saw, but because it was so easy to do. Why could a national idol be executed in the middle of a nightclub there without anyone even flinching, let alone hesitating? Why did the suspected masterminds walk away free? Why was that line of investigation shelved? To answer that, you have to go back to the beginning, to that man who was running on the roof, remember? The other Escobar. The man who was running on the roof and who fell down there, right? 7 months before Andrés' case. Yes, as everyone already knows, it was Pablo Escobar. The same Pablito from the headline back in '89, the owner of the Metro Cartel. One of the biggest cocaine traffickers in history, with a fortune estimated in the billions of dollars at his peak. The man whose shadow loomed over Atlético Nacional and over that golden team where Andrés grew up. A team that, like much of Colombian soccer at that time, became forever associated with the money and influence of Marco Trafa. The two were not related, as I said. Escobar is a very common last name there, like Silva is here. But they were connected by something wonderful, stronger than blood. The soccer that made Andrés an idol was the same soccer that was entangled with the cartel. Betting, intimidation, money laundering, and bosses who treated the club as an extension of their power. And it wasn't just money coming in, it was real control over the game itself. On the other side, bosses connected to the Cali cartel were also associated with another Colombian giant, America de Cali. In that environment, reports and suspicions of bribery, betting, and pressure on referees were part of the daily life of soccer. The situation reached a point where even the referee became a real target. In 1989, referee Alvaro Ortega was murdered after a match surrounded by suspicions, betting, and pressure from criminal groups. That was the level of corruption in Colombian soccer at that time. And that was the world in which the gentlemen played soccer. Soccer, where the one who paid the bills also decided who won, who lost, and sometimes who lived. On December 2nd, 1993, the Colombian security forces finally cornered Pablo on a rooftop in Medellin and killed the man. 7 months before Andrés' case, like I said, while Pablo was alive, he was a terrifying authority, but he was still an authority. There was a hierarchy to it. People who lived through that say that hardly anything big happened in Medellin without him knowing about it or giving the final word. There was a pyramid, like I said, of command. There were rules, no matter how twisted they were. Pablo's own cousin summed it up in a phrase which even became famous. According to him, none of that would have happened under Pablo's command because Pablo had rules. With Pablo dead, those rules died with him. What was left was a vacuum, several groups fighting over pieces of the empire, no one answering to anyone, each one thinking they could do anything. It's the same thing the national team coach meant when he said that at that moment anyone could die. Remember? The death threats by fax during the World Cup, Andrés' execution in the crowded parking lot, the suspected masterminds walking free. And this obviously is not just a series of bad luck. There's a reason behind all this, right? It's the portrait of a city that had just lost some of the most brutal and perverse restraints that existed in that underworld. And the Gallon brothers were exactly part of that world that was left behind. Years after the crime, they would appear connected to the Envigado workshop, the organization that was born from the ashes of the Medellin cartel and inherited, let's say, the business of the old boss. They would even end up on the United States Treasury's blacklist in 2015, accused of trafficking. One of them would even be accused of financing paramilitary groups. In other words, guys, the men who ordered the killing or killed the horsemen were not random criminals. They were, quote-unquote, direct heirs of the world that Pablo built, and that, after he fell on that rooftop, was left without a clear owner and without law. And look, there's an extra layer here, okay? One of those that really gives you chills. But I want to say this with a caveat, okay? The underworld that took over Medellin after Pablo was, in part, built by his former allies who had betrayed the boss and helped the police hunt him down. If the Gallon specifically were in this group of traitors, I've only seen that stated in dramatized material, okay? So we can't say that for sure. What is solid for real is that they were part of this post-Pablo world, the world that only existed because Pablo died first. This connection between the two Escobars became so strong in the country's memory that it even turned into a documentary. Years ago, two American filmmakers made a movie called The Two Escobars, telling side by side the rise of the drug lord and the fall of the player as reflections of each other. And in the face of all this, you start to understand that the story is over and that's just how it's going to stay, right? But then it comes back. In February 2026, more than 30 years later, Santiago Gallon, one of the brothers who were in that parking lot, was found dead in Mexico, shot in the state of Mexico. The president of Colombia himself, Gustavo Petro, confirmed the death and went further. He said finally publicly that in his view, Gallon was one of those responsible for Andrés' murder. And that crime destroyed the country's international image. And here's that version I said I would tell you about later, remember? Yeah, according to what he found out, Andrés wasn't actually killed because of the own goal. The president's version is that it was out of jealousy during an argument inside the nightclub. Just another explanation thrown on top of a motive that no one ever confirmed or proved. Andrés was only 27 years old when he was shot in a cowardly attack. More than 120,000 people attended his funeral in Medellin. And the Colombian national team left the number 2 jersey, which was his, unworn for several years. And do you remember the column that Andrés wrote after the World Cup, asking the country to look forward? That's right, it ends with a sentence that, when read today, has a very deep meaning. See you soon, because life doesn't end here. He wrote that to comfort the whole country. 10 days later, he lost his life. But as we've seen, the hard truth of this story inevitably leads back to that rooftop, doesn't it? For one of the most beloved men in Colombian soccer to be executed like that in a parking lot over some random fight and for almost no one to pay for it, there was already a country immersed in the power of drug trafficking, in impunity, and in the void left by the fall of the most powerful man in Colombian crime. 7 months earlier, shot on a rooftop. Of course, it wasn't Pablo Escobar's hand that pulled the trigger that killed Andrés Escobar, but you could say that Andrés died. Inside the world that Pablo helped build, and in the violent void that was left when that world lost its owner. It's a complicated story, isn't it, guys? But I want to know your opinion. What do you think is true here? Did those traffickers really lose money on bets? Were those bets really that significant? Did they fail to prove in the investigation whether there was actually a huge volume of bets? That's not mentioned. Could it have really been just a fight inside the club out of jealousy or something like that? Or was it just a show of power because they didn't care whether the state would punish the killer? Only the driver actually paid, right? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. Check your subscription and become a member to support the productions if possible. Don't forget to like. A kiss from Vivo. See you next episode.